بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to another class in reading this great book of Islam, Lub al-Usul by Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah. Inshallah, we're going to pick up right where we left off, which is we are in the middle of the book 6, giving preference to proofs. And remember, I said after the introductory remarks that we did a couple of lectures ago, essentially everything from after the introduction to the end of this book, to the end of this chapter, is like a long drop down list of we give preference to this over this, this over this, this over this. And while just to repeat again, while a lot of it I think is intuitive, a lot of it, we give strength, preference to a mutawatir tradition over an ahad tradition. I mean, obviously that makes sense. However, some of them, are points of commenting. In addition to, from a sort of pedagogical point of view, I think if I gave you a drop-down list of 75 things, it's likelihood you won't retain very much. So that's sort of why I decided not to rush in and like do all of this book or chapter in one lecture, which is, I guess, kind of possible. But I don't think it's going to be service for me or for you. Definitely won't do the subject justice. So we're going to pick up where we left off, and it's just going to be more of what we did in the last class. But this time we're going to go more into meanings. So remember way back when in the first lecture or the first module of this book, we talked about Dala'il al-Alfaz, how we understand things from, the meanings that we get from words. So one of the unique things is in this lecture, we're going to get into that as well and revisit some of that terminology. The other thing that's unique is he actually does, which I find super useful, is he gets into the issue of inheritance law and other points of Islamic law. And by that we make 2 points. One point is that inheritance, al-fara'id, is considered its own science. Even though it's law, it's very possible to go through all of law and not do inheritance because it's considered its own law. And that's kind of alluded to in the way he discusses it. And then the second thing, he's going to talk about the 3 main Sahaba that Imam Shafi'i took the narrations from in matters of inheritance, which is Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu. I mean, we've talked about that before. And also Mu'adh ibn Jabal and Imam Ali alayhi salam, as far as other points of law. So that's one of the unique things in today's lecture. Okay, without further ado, we'll begin in the next clip, inshallah. So we begin the way we always begin these classes, which is to, other than the red pen, is to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. So Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. I'm going to pick up right from where we left off in the text. He says, وَالْعَامُ مُطْلَقًا عَلَى ذِي سَبَبٍ إِلَّا فِي السَّبَبِ. And then he says, we take preference of the absolute general over the general linked to a specific cause. Because the general and the absolute, al-mutlaq, is mutlaq. It's going to be general for all times, places, spaces, considerations, people, circumstances, so on and so forth. If it's a general statement, but it's pegged to something specific, we've already specified something which is general. So I hope you can see that the general, which is, I go like this with my hands, which is wider, is going to be, preferred over something specific. Why? Again, one of the principles of studying Islamic law is to acknowledge that the statements of the Sharia, the statements of the Quran, meaning the verses of the Quran and the hadith attributed to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, are limited. The 6,236 verses and about 120,000 hadith and all of the variances and recensions, that is, and strengths. Mahdud, so that's a limited number. But all of the circumstances that human beings face from the time of the Risala till now, and inshallah until the end of time, are essentially never ending in comparison. I mean, they're obviously in Allah's knowledge, they're ending, but you know what I mean. It's just a figure of speech. So we're always going to prefer the general, the mutlaq, over the mutlaq that's pegged to a specific thing, because the mutlaq guides us to all of that stuff. When the Prophet ﷺ says, La darar wa la dirar, there's no cause, there's no harm or reciprocating harm or causing harm to yourself or returning harm. That's a general statement. Anytime there's harm, we're going to eliminate that, or the Sharia will seek to limit that. And then he says, وَالْعَامُ الشرطي على النكرة المنفية في الأصح. And we preference the conditional general over the negating non-definite. So the conditional general, which is sort of what the second half of the first pair that we did, the conditional general will be preferred over the negating non-definite because it's a negation. So the affirmation is always going to be preferred over a negation because the affirmation is again going to be wider than the situations or the scenarios in which we negate. وهي على الباقي, and the general over what is beneath it, which is just like a general principle, like I was just kind of alluding to before. والجمع المعرف على من وما وكلها على الجنس المعرف. The plural will take preference over the plural when we respond to men and ma. So if there's men, men hada, who is this, or ma hada, what is this, we're going to, the response to that comes in the general, in the plural form, afwan, will be preferred over that which is going to come that's limited or singular or dual. And all other plurals that we have in language. So this is something that we're going to take from that section, the first section of the book, when we talked about language. وَمَا لَمْ يُخَص, and we take preference over that which has not been restricted. Well, obviously, because it's another form of general, so we don't want things that are restricted. وَالْأَقَلُّ تَخْصِيصًا, and that which is restricted the least. So you can see already there's like a slight aversion to restriction. Restriction is very helpful when it comes to law because it makes the job of the mujtahid easier, makes the job of the qadi, the mufti, the jurist much easier because it's restricted. And you can only pray in the times of prayer. I mean, like for example, there's a waqt, there's a hadd there, there's a definition. But from the point of view of preferential treatment of how we prefer evidence, there's going to be a little bit of an aversion because it's limited in use. We'll always prefer and want to seek out that which is general. If you read a lot of fatwa literature today, which by the way is an essential part of your journey as a student, you got to read the fatwa literature of any madhab or any fatwa body, whether you agree with it or not, because you have to learn how the muftis and the mujtahids today talk about these things. You will find almost always they will begin by the general kind of proofs in trying to draw home their point. So that's what أقل تخصيصا. والاقتداء بالإيماء عفوا والاقتداء فالإيماء فالإشارة ويرجحان على المفهومين. And then we're going to give preference to an associated meaning, اقتضاء, and then a meaning by indication, إيماء, and then meanings of allusions, إشارة. So associated, then indicated, then allusions. Well, you can even see just by the words themselves that the associated meaning, it's like mulazim, it's like part of the thing, it's part of that which is defining it, and then the other two meanings are lesser in strength. This has to do with dala'il al-alfaz, the evidence and the proofs that we get from the linguistic structure of the Arabic language, which is the official language of the Sharia. This is what we talked about in the first section, and these terms have sort of come up all the time in all sorts of sections. They even come up in the section of qiyas. So again, we'll prefer the associated meaning because that's the quickest, unequivocal meaning. And then meanings of indication, then meanings of illusions. Now, this does not mean that illusionary meanings, the ishara, is weak, because all of tasawwuf, or lots of tasawwuf, is based on ishara. There are even tafasir of, tafsir al-ishari, the illusion tafasir. Here, please keep in mind that we are talking about the order of proofs that we prefer in the process of ijtihad. So we're talking about something very specific. When we're trying to deduct laws, rules, principles, precedents for the ummah to follow, to guide their actions, this is the order. This is not about meaning in general. So sometimes sometimes it's one of those situations where you can't see the trees for the forest. kind of situation. So you just got to step back and remind yourself, what he just said, where does that fall in the Sharia? And then the last two are given preference, meaning indication, ima, and illusions, ishara. Those two are given preference based on understood and opposite meanings. So, muwafaqa and mukhalafa. So, we prefer the ima and the ishara, the indication and the illusions, over the muwafaqa and the mukhalafa. And then he says, وَكَذَا الْمُوَافَقَةُ عَلَى الْمُخَالَفَةِ. And then when it comes to muwafaqa and mukhalafa, we are going to prefer the muwafaqa, the matching meaning, over the opposite meaning, because the opposite meaning you got to do a couple more steps. The associated meaning you also have to kind of like deduct. But the first batch, which is iqtida, ima, and ishara, are more direct in the derivation, devising, is that right? Deriving of the meanings. Sorry if I mispronounced it. Then muwafaqa and mukhalafa. So it's a little bit of like a philosophical understanding. Yani you're gonna mentally, some of these you're gonna take a couple of more steps than the other kinds, and the ones that have less step of thinking, or less logical steps, or less deductive steps, is always going to be preferred over those which have more steps because it's just shorter. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَالنَّاقِلُ عَنِ الْأَصْلِ وَالْمُثْبِتُ فِي الْأَصَحِ. And then, Allahumma salli ala Sayyid Muhammad, transmitted, we're going to prefer the transmitted over the original default meaning. The original default meaning is al-bara'atul asliya, the presumed understanding of innocence in the beginning. So obviously that which is transmitted is going to be preferred over that, because that's kind of like a default. It's not, we talked about, for example, if something is bara'atul asliya, the default presumption of innocence, and then a hukum comes, we don't call that naskh, for example. That's not a form of abrogation. So there is the default presumption of innocence, but it's not really like a ruling, he's saying. So, obviously if we have something that's transmitted, naql, a tradition or a verse or an understanding of the imams, we're going to prefer that over the default presence, because then we've introduced something on purpose. I'll pause here, pick it up in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so the last thing we talked about was the naql an al-asl, which is to prefer the transmitted over the original default ruling, which is the assumed presumption of innocence. And then wal-muthbitu fil asah, and then the text that establishes over the one that negates. Again, establishing is stronger than a negation. So when we have a rule that establishes something, especially if that rule is general, that's beautiful. For us, that's perfect. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for. Textbook, ijtihad evidence. But then something that negates, what exactly is it negating? Is it negating something specific? Is it negating something general? Is it negating something with conditions? There are all of these considerations. So the muthbit, the establishing text or proof, is going to be preferred over the negating proof. And you will find, nothing comes to mind, but I know I have found this before, you will find when mujtahids argue with one another, that there is a tendency to critique another school's position because it's based on negation. You'll find that. So it's, that's da'if, they'll say. Why isn't it affirmed? If it's so important, why is it, if what you said in this specific instance is so important, why is it not affirmed? Why is it negated? And then he says, وَالْخَبَرُ فَالْحَذَرُ فَالْإِجَابُ فَالْكِرَاهَةُ فَالنَّدْبُ فَالْإِبَاحَةُ فِي الْأَصَحِ فِي بَعْضِهَا. And then I lost my place in the translation, my bad. One second. And then the text that establishes over the one that negates, statements of information over insha. So, al-khabar, statements of information over insha. This is from the commentary. I'm lifting it up. versus statements that are created by the person speaking, because the khabar can be verified, whereas in the insha is not verified. So the verifiable text will be preferred over, obviously, the text is not verified. And then warnings, then obligations, then dislike, then the permissible, then the possible, and the dominant opinion. So the warning, the hadar, we're going to always prefer that, because in the sharia we want to make sure that we stay away from the haram. If you miss something that's like recommended or something, it's not as bad as if you accidentally do something that's haram. That can be bad, because you can live your whole life in the haram not knowing it. You're forgiven, but there's going to be other spiritual ailments that come from that, like Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I mean, let's just say there's like a new food or like a cookie or something that's like made clearly with like pork product, not something in which there's ijtihad. It's like clearly it's haram, but you don't know, and you're like chowing down on that. I mean, eventually, down the line, that's going to affect your spiritual relationship with Allah Ta'ala, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Atib mat'amak takun mustajab du'a." Purify what you eat, Allah will accept your dua. So there is a spiritual connection with the ahkam, which is why, again, tasawwuf is a part of this subject. It's not something that's separate. So, someone can say, well, won't you be forgiven? 110 million % you'll be forgiven. Allah does not take us to account if we do something by mistake, but it might have and could have spiritual ailments. So we prefer the warning over the other ones, because we want to avoid the haram. Then we go to the obligatory next, and then the dislike, the makruh, because it's just better to stay away from the makruh, but you can certainly do the makruh. Then the permissible, and then the possible, because that's the lowest of them in the dominant opinion. Of course, there will be differences of opinion, particularly with the first two. And then he says, وَالْمَعْقُولُ مَعْنَاهُ, and then what is understood rationally. Obviously, because then it's understood rationally, so we're going to prefer that over something that's not. وَكَذَا نَافِي الْعُقُوبَةِ, then what is understood to negate a punishment. Because then we avoid doing something that we're not supposed to be doing based on wrong evidence. To that he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Al-Baqarah 185, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ, and then in Al-Hajj 78, مَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. So, if there's something that negates a punishment, we're going to prefer that, obviously, because then that's the ease that the Sharia is advocating. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْوَضَعِيُّ عَلَى التَّكْلِيفِ فِي الْأَصَحِ. Then rules established over rules of moral responsibility in the dominant opinion. So the hukm al-wada'i, or the established rulings, like this is a shart, this is a mana, etc., we're going to prefer those because it's a general rule versus the derived ruling of taklif, which is going to be more narrow. In other words, the wada'i is going to require less mental steps, less rational steps, less logical steps than the taklifi. That's what he's saying. So again, it's like the Senate. If the Senate is shorter, we prefer it. It's kind of the same thing. If it takes less mental steps to arrive at that, we'll prefer it over what is not. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. وَالْمُوَافِقُ دَلِيلًا آخَرَ. And then that which matches another proof, because then it's supported. Okay? وكذا مرسلا أو صحابيا أو أهل المدينة أو الأكثر في الأصح. And then we give preference to the mursal text or a companion from Medina, for the reasons we talked about yesterday. They're later in the game, so what they have will have incorporated any nasakh or anything like that, or the majority of the schools in the dominant opinion. So somebody like Imam al-Sha'rani, for example, rahimahullah, he has this great book, Al-Mizan al-Kubra, where he assumes, and well, he doesn't assume, he is of the opinion, and this is kind of like the real with a capital R, that all of the madhahib are really one madhab, but they fluctuate in degrees of rulings. In other words, when we can avoid al-khuruj an al-ikhtilaf mustahab, so when we can go against differences of opinion amongst the madhabs, it's better to do that. So even though we are Shafi'i, we are always going to try to find the position that fulfills our madhab's fulfillments as well as the other ones, and promote that over just what we have. Sometimes it doesn't work, but when we can That's important. Okay, and then he says, وَيُرَجَّحُ. Let me just read this section. Yeah. And then he says, رحمه الله, وَيُرَجَّحُ مُوَافَقُ زَيْدٍ فِي الْفَرَائِدِ مُعَاذٍ فَعَلَيْهِ رضي الله عنه ومعاذ في أحكام غير الفرائض فعليه والإجماع على النص. And then he says, we give preference to the opinions of Zayd ibn Thabit in the matter of inheritance, then Mu'adh ibn Jabal, and then Imam Ali alayhi salam and radiallahu anhu ajma'in. And in matters other than inheritance, we give preference to Mu'adh, then Imam Ali, then the consensus over the text. So let me just read for you this hadith, which is important, or portions of the hadith. I believe this is in the Tirmidhi, but the Prophet ﷺ said, Afradukum Zayd, the most knowledgeable amongst you in inheritance is Zayd. وَأَعْلَمُكُمْ بِالْحَلَالِ وَالْحَرَامِ Mu'adh. The most knowledgeable in matters of the halal and the haram is Mu'adh. And then وَأَخْضَاكُمْ عَلَيْهِ, and the most knowledgeable in issues of adjudication in court cases as judgeship is Ali. So those are three separate, alayhi salam, these are three separate sections. So in the matters of inheritance, we are going to prefer the narrations of Zayd, then Mu'adh, and then Ali. Meaning that if Zayd doesn't say something, we'll look at Mu'adh, if Mu'adh doesn't, and then Ali. Because of this hadith, and because most of the hadith traditions that go back to the fara'id go back to Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu. And then in matters other than that, in matters of fiqh, of just positive law, then we're going to look at Mu'adh and then Ali. But in matters of ijtihad, which is not, I mean, it can get lost because it's not stated, it's Imam Ali. You know, أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها وعلي بابها. I am the city of knowledge and Ali alayhi salam is its gate. So this is just so people don't think that this is a Sunni Shia thing, this is just an Islam thing. This does not mean that Imam Ali is not the most knowledgeable of the Sahaba. The Prophet ﷺ was addressing something specific. You know, so here we're talking specifically in inheritance law. We trace the traditions of Zayd. In matters of halal and haram, which are basically the ahkam of the Sharia, that has to do with our actions, we're going to look at Mu'adh. And then when it comes to the issues of the concept of ijtihad and spiritual perfection, those two things are tied into the person of Imam Ali alayhi as-salam. And then he says consensus over a text. So in the books of fiqh, like when I studied at Al-Azhar, for example, I'm see that I'm running out of time. Let me pick up this little story as a segue into the next clip, inshallah. We ended in the last clip saying we take consensus over a text. So I remember when I was at Al-Azhar and we would study these like introductory / medium level books of fiqh. It would say وَالدَّلِيل بَعْدَ الْإِجْمَاعِ كذا. So the dalil, the proof of what we just read in fiqh after consensus is the following verse and is the following hadith. So if you look at, like Ibn Qasim, Al-Ghazi on the Matn of Abi Shuja, or the Hashiyat of Al-Bajuri, which is basically the text we use for our fiqh classes in the university, that's the way it's written, right? So ijma' comes before the individual textual proof, because ijma' means that a lot of effort came before it, that the mujtahids agreed and all the things that we talked about in ijma' happened. So that's going to be superior and rock solid versus me saying the dalil is this verse, because then you might say, but I have another reading of this verse, or there's another verse or another hadith mutawatir that says such and such. So it's not that the Quran and Sunnah are not enough. Of course they're enough, but I think there could be differences of how we understand them. But when we say that this is ijma', what's the dalil of the 5 prayers? The first dalil is ijma'. Everyone knows that there's 5 prayers, Sunnis and Shias, for example. Right? And then you would get into the individual details of this hadith when Gabriel taught the Prophet ﷺ the prayers and the timings of the prayers, things like that. Consensus over the text. وإجماع السابقين وإجماع الكل على ما خالف فيه العوام والمنقرض عصره على غيره. Then we take preference of consensus of the previous generation over consensus now, because there could be a situation now where somebody will dissent later. We talked about that kind of being a possibility, not in the dominant position, but it could happen. So if something happened in the past, like the first generations, that's golden for us. Khalas, it's done. We don't have to think about it anymore. We can just move on to the next issue. Then consensus of all people over those from the common Muslims who dissent. So all people meaning the mujtahid. So we take the consent. So an individual Muslim's dissent doesn't really count in the matter of ijtihad. And I know that sounds very harsh and crass, but I mean, this is a very technical thing. So how can somebody who's not even a jurist, let alone a non-studied general Muslim, how can their position really count towards anything when we're dealing with a technical matter of law? And that sentence also means the majority of Muslims is taken over the dissenting Muslims. So there are matters in which there are global Muslim concern, and there are, in that matter, people that will dissent. So if the vast majority of the Muslims agree to something, مَا رَآهُ الْمُسْلِمُونَ حَسَنًا فَهُوَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ حَسَنًا, the Prophet ﷺ said that which the Muslims see as good is with Allah Ta'ala good. So our consensus as Muslims is protected. Usually we use that hadith to indicate the consensus of the mujtahids, but it could also just be the public sentiment of the Muslim community over a certain matter. So in our mosque, we're having, I'm just making up a scenario, we're having an issue, should we go to this interfaith event or not? And we have a general meeting, and so it's not an issue of ijtihad and fiqh and usul and sharia and all that kind of qiyas, shabah and all, it's not like that, it's just a general issue. And we talked, and the majority of the masjid community says no, we should go. But there's a couple of people that are much more against it. We're going to go with the majority. That's what he's saying in that case, because it's going to be stronger. Alaykum bis-sawad al-a'zam. The Prophet ﷺ said, follow the vast majority of people. وَمَنْ شَذَّ شَذَّ فِي النَّارِ. And those that go against them, they're going to go towards the hellfire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. وكذا ما لم يسبق بخلاف في الأصح والأصح تساوي المتواترتين من كتاب وسنة. The consensus of the age that has passed over other kinds, also the consensus that has not been preceded by a difference of opinion in the dominant opinion, because then that means there's no blemish or question marks on that type of ijtihad. And then the current position is an equal status of diffusely congruent text in the Quran and Sunnah, the mutawatir. So all of the Quran is mutawatir. So from a proof power point of view, the mutawatir Quran is at the same level as the mutawatir hadith, and the mutawatir hadith is at the same level as the mutawatir Quran. So we don't prefer one over the other, and that's why we are known as Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of Sunnah and the community, because this is one of the hallmarks of how we think and how we do things. Okay. ويرجح القياس بقوة الدليل حكم الأصل وكونه على سنن القياس أي فرعه من جنس أصله. We give preference to analogy with the strength of the proof of the original ruling, and that the analogy branch rule is based on the same type as the original legal issue. So basically, another way of saying, the stronger the qiyas, the more preference we're going to give to it. So if what's the dalil of the qiyas? The strength of the dalil will give us preference in this qiyas over another qiyas. And also, is this branch issue similar to the original legal issue? If so, we're going to give preference if over a qiyas in which the branch issue is not necessarily similar, which we talked about qiyas or shabah, in which it kind of looks like this, it kind of looks like that. That's not going to be preferred over one in which it's the same kind. So if we're dealing with riba in certain type of grains, well, we have precedence of riba in grains and specific grains that have been identified. So we can add rice to that because it's an easier type of qiyas. We can add other alcoholic drinks to the tahrim of alcohol because it's the same kind. That's going to be much easier than finding a branch legal issue that's not really related at all. And then lastly he says, وَكَذَا ذَاتُ أَصْلَيْنِ عَلَى ذَاتِ أَصْلٍ وَذَاتِيَةٌ عَلَى حكمية وكونه أقل أوصافا في الأصح. Preference to that which has two bases over one base. So the more roots you have to your legal argument, the more preference is going to be given to that over something that has less, because then it's going to be verified multiple times over. And that which is actual over that which is just a ruling. So, actual najasa versus something that could be considered najas just because of its ruling, but you can't see it. For example, you're going to give preference to that which you can see. That's just an example that I think he actually gives that in the book. And then preference to that which has the least number of descriptions, because it's just closer of an argument, simpler of an argument, less steps of the argument. So a lot of the things that we took today, you kind of see this as a repeated theme, is that which is going to get us to the conclusion quicker and faster, is always going to be preferred over that which takes us a long time to go out. Now, I have just a little time left, so I do want to just say this, which is, do not underestimate this chapter or this book just because it's a drop-down list. It is important to understand to understand what he's saying, of course, but the reason behind it. The shorter sanad, the shorter legal argument, the more apparent meaning, the argument that has more proofs, the consensus that is not questioned. So I want you to learn the rhyme and reason behind it, the philosophy behind it, which is to give us cleaner, more reliable legal arguments than the opposites. Also, I do want to mention that some of these are differences of opinion. So a lot of the lines he said in the dominant position, the current opinion, so on and so forth. So there are dissents, in the usul al-fiqh category for other reasons. But he is presenting to us the most kind of authoritative and the most reliable kind of positions that we're going to go with. So there's no reason at this point for us to consider the dissenting opinions. Well, first of all, there are too many. And then secondly, the way we are presenting it, it kind of shows you the congruence of the argument. The shortest argument, the one that was the most proofs, the shortest chain of transmission, the older the generation of consensus, etc., etc., etc. It's always going to be cleaner. And so I don't want you also, as you do your review, I do not want you to be overly concerned with these differences of opinion. This is not the time to do it. Some of the other times in some of the other places of the book, I have asked you to be, or I've acknowledged, like when we talked about Nasakh, for example, it's a famous example in my classes, I do talk about the difference of opinion extensively because it's significant. In this case, don't worry so much about that. Kind of just learn the material that we're presenting. Okay, we'll put a pin in here and we'll finish this up tomorrow. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, we made a huge dent in today's class with book 6 giving preference to the proofs. We picked up where we left off and we're almost towards the end. I probably could have squeezed in the end, but it's just looking at the list now, it's just too much. So I didn't want to overwhelm myself and you. We talked sort of the same pattern as the last class, but one of the things that we did talk about today is we talked about dala'ul al-alfad, the type of, the way we understand language which was in the very beginning of the book, came back here. And the pattern that we're looking at is that meanings that are closer, more direct, are going to be preferred over meanings in which you have to do a couple of steps or are not direct, for obvious reasons, which is that they are direct. So we looked at that, and then we also looked at issues of fiqh itself. So we looked at inheritance law and other issues of fiqh. We talked about the hadith that the most knowledgeable of inheritance is Zayd, the most knowledgeable in halal and haram is Mu'adh, the most knowledgeable in matters of ijtihad or court cases is Imam Ali alayhi salam radiallahu anhum ajma'in. I just wanted to highlight that those are like three different things and why we give preference to Zayd in matters of inheritance and then Mu'adh and then Imam Ali in other matters of law, for that reason, because that tradition, and so that's the preference that you're going to find in the furu'a of the madhab. Then we talked a little bit towards the end about ijma' and qiyas, consensus of the people before us, consensus in which there's no dissent, consensus of then versus consensus that's ongoing now. All of those preferences we kind of talked about. In addition to issues of qiyas, that basically a more direct qiyas or a qiyas that's clear, that's based on a known legal issue, that the branch issue is similar to the original legal issue. Those are the type of things that are going to allow us to prefer one form of qiyas over another. It does not mean, by the way, when we talk about preference, it doesn't mean that the thing that we're not preferencing is not valid. It just means it's not as strong as the thing that we're preferencing. So, so when a mujtahid does their work and then they have all of these options in front of us, this is what will inform which one do they pick over the other. And you can see how in that is a little bit of subjectivity, so there'll be differences of opinion even in the tarajuh, even in the preferring over certain proofs over another. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.